you all so much for braving the cold to come out today, and thank you to our panelists who are here today. Some of you may be taking your lunch hour. We have students here, so thank all of you for being at this event for the Festival of Ideas. A couple of announcements before I forget. If you have a coat and would like to divest yourself of that coat while you were in here, there is a coat rack in the back behind the main entrance. If you would like to keep it on, that's fine too. And then the entrance you came in is also your exit. There are other doors in the museum, but they are not exit doors and they are alarmed. So please make sure you go out the main entrance, the main exit. We are very fortunate today to have with us Josh Smith. Many of you will recognize his face. He is probably not unknown to any of you. And he is here to be our host for the panel today. And so I will turn it over to him and our wonderful panelists.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And welcome to the Reese Museum. It's my honor to be with you today. And it's just a joy to walk on this campus as we're all in the freezing cold and see all these smiling faces under these big hats going to class. And I'm reminded of the beauty and the blessing of ETSU in our community. So it's just a joy for me to be here. Thank you so much to our panelists who've come, and I'm going to introduce them to you. But I first want to say a big thank you to Dr. Jeff Howard and to Dr. Susan Bramlett-Epps, who've been incredibly involved in putting not only this event on, but the events that have happened and the biggie coming up tomorrow night. Guys, DKG's on her way. And when I saw that, I nerded out completely in the News Channel 11 newsroom and was so excited. So if you see someone, you know, kind of following her around and he's bald, it's me. So with that said, I want to welcome our panelists today. You're going to be hearing from all of them, I hope. That's my job, to make sure we have new wallflowers. Whatever, right? And to make sure that we engage all of you, and not so much a presentation as much as a discussion and a conversation. So please welcome Dr. David Briley, an Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of Masters of Public Administration program at ETSU. He teaches courses in the area of American politics, including American government and politics, state and local politics, Southern politics, and the President and Congress. Hold your applause to the end. Dr. Darrell Carter is an Associate Professor in the Department of History with an expertise in 20th and 21st century American political history, with the impact of race, class, and gender on political history. He's the author of Brother Bill, President Clinton, and the Politics of Race and Class. Dr. Andrew Dunn is an Associate Professor in Media and Communications, the head of the journalism program here. His research focuses on avatars, virtual identity, and communication technology, as well as media psychology. Dr. Colin Glennon is with us. Dr. Glennon is Assistant Professor of Political Science and Coordinator of the Legal Studies minor program. His teaching includes areas of American political institutions, of course, the presidency, Congress, and the bureaucracy, as well as American court structure, law, and society. And please welcome ETSU President Dr. Brian Nolan, who I hear was the brainchild behind the festival ideas for that year. To be congratulated, Dr. Nolan. And we figured since he's a president and he has to deal with the media, and trust me, he does, he's probably got something to say. So let's have a big welcome to our panelists today. Nothing to get us all warmed up than to talk about the president and the press, all right? That's, by the way, especially you college students, don't do that when you go to your future in-laws' house for Thanksgiving. Right? Avoid those topics. But we're going to embrace them today here. And I want to just open up by saying that as I was driving onto campus and thought, where in the world am I going to park? A couple of things congealed in my head. Number one, there are some obvious things, right? Obviously. We know that any of you could talk for an hour about our topic at hand without much prep and give a great lecture. So we're going to try to keep our answers short and keep the topics moving. Another obvious is that we could talk about the presidency and the press right now in terms of sort of diagnosing it, right? Like it ain't healthy. Or it's great, you know, and we're going to get to that, but I'd like to sort of start off with a deconstruct of how we got to where we are now. So as we, by the way, welcome our viewers who are watching us live streaming on WJHL.com. Don't be nervous. I want to open the floor with a discussion about how we got to where we are now. And specifically, panelists, historically, we have the media, which essentially is anyone with a laptop or a YouTube channel right now and a Twitter account, all the way up to the network and the Washington Post, right? This broad top of media. But then we have the press pool, right? That group of humans that lives, breathes every movement of the president, every moment at the White House. When did we historically, and Dr. Bradley, I'm just going to start with you, and if anybody want to jump in, when did we begin to see this emergence of a dedicated press corps assigned to the president? Was it Washington, or did it come later?
I don't know, you might want to go back to the 19th century, but if I can go to the turn of the century, I would think with TR. I mean, he was such a huge figure, and the press, I mean, they say they loved him. He certainly was, like to generate a lot of he was out there in the press and like self-important, if you will. And I mean, if you see the pictures or videos, you'll see them, they're right there in front of him. And it's continued today. Now, obviously, the press has changed, and I'm sure Andrew Farrell can speak to that. But I'd say the monitor starts right there.
Start with TR. Okay. Can anyone go further back in your institutional? And by the way, these mics, we're going to have to sort of huddle around, get each other's bubble, exchange some germs. A little bit. Anyone earlier? Did we see the press corps emerge with the president earlier than TR?
I'm not sure that you saw a press corps so much as you did see presidents that took an interest in at least maintaining a relationship and even controlling the press. I mean, you look at Andrew Jackson, and had one of arguably the first press secretaries. And so, and you have a long history of really presidents managing the press. I mean, you go all the way back to John Adams and the Federalists and the Alien and Sedition Acts, 1798, where you had people that were being jailed for sedition, for criticism of the government. And so we're talking about his political rivals. So back then you would buy a newspaper based on his politics. It's totally different today, right? Nothing like today, correct? So back then you would buy your newspaper based on your politics, and you would have obviously people that were critical of Adams, and he didn't like that. A lot of other things dealing with the French and Jefferson, yada yada. I mean, I could go on about that. Point was, he went after his critics, his journalist critics, and actually put some in jail. It was roughly about 12 or 13. Most of them were Jeffersonian newspaper people. So we've had a long history of this combative nature. And even if you want to go back before that, John Peter Zenger, during the colonial era, you have somebody who is critical of the appointed governor, the British appointed governor, being critical. He's brought to trial. He's charged with sedition again, criticism of the government. But the jury decided they didn't care because they didn't like the governor either. And so the process known as jury nullification, they just threw the case out. And so that's really one of the first areas where you see, heads of government in this country and the press really butting heads. Not the only, but one of the first.
So you're saying essentially from the start of it all.
I personally argue it's from the start, but coming from the journalism side of things, maybe have a different perspective.
And one we appreciate. Dr. Glennon, do you have any thoughts on that idea of when we began to see the emergence of a press corps dedicated to and committed to independently reporting on the office of the presidency?
Well, I don't know if this directly answers your question, but my thought was, when you started sort of speaking about the history of it, my first thought was Andrew Jackson as well. And you mentioned Adams and sort of going after his critics, but that ends poorly for him, right? And it's an unpopular move. When Jefferson takes office, there are, I think, almost all, if not all, getting pardons, right? And so Jackson sort of saw that approach fail and sort of tries the opposite tack, that instead of going after his enemies, he tries to reward his friends. And Jackson becomes largely the first president who on multiple occasions was rewarding those who gave him favorable coverage, be that through access or cushy sort of government positions, right? Whether that's the exact beginning of a dedicated press corps, I don't know, but that's where my mind sort of went when you started talking about the question, that interesting sort of dichotomy of approach, right? One that sort of tried to be vindictive and it didn't really work, and the other one who said, okay, if that fails, what if I just, sort of give rewards to those who treat me positively? And that's sort of an interesting approach to take.
Dr. Carter, how about you?
I would not disagree with any of my esteemed colleagues here. I would focus more on the last 60 years or so, particularly the end of the Eisenhower era and the beginning of the Kennedy era, in which you go from reporters, particularly print reporters, standing around the president in the White House taking noses, they're interviewing him, to John Kennedy, who is standing live on television doing interviews. That was extraordinary. He was warned not to do it, but they turned into these wonderful events in which every president since has been expected to appear before the media on camera. And in addition to that, a development between the 1960s and the 2000s of a much more professional media. So from a media in 1962 or 63, which is almost incestuous and unprofessional, we would say today, to a very standardized press in a very different way in the 2000s, with a clear separation in many respects between their editorial boards and the regular beat reporters. That took a lot of time to develop. I would say that was an important aspect of the press corps as we have these last 50, 60 years.
So moving that forward, and some of you touched on this, and Dr. Nolan, I'd like to start with you, an instance in which you can think of a president, a specific president, memorable for the way that he interacted with the press that covered it. And some of you touched on this. Is there one that in your studies of history, Dr. Nolan, that stands out to you, just memorable for the way that there was an interaction there?
I would go back to the example that Dr. Carter provided with respect to Kennedy. Kennedy was the first president to understand the power of the modern press. And the modern press then began to change the way in which the office was covered. No longer was it covered as an office, it was covered as an individual, and you learned about the individual characteristics of the person who held the office. If you look back just a couple presidencies prior to FDR, think about FDR. Think about the deference that was afforded to the president, the manner in which his physical maladies were not covered within the press. The press was complicit in ensuring that there was protection for the president. If that were today, we would know everything about the wheelchair. We would know the manufacturer. We would know the folks who put it together. We would know the stories of the individuals who dressed him each morning, the process that we went through for the leg braces and the back brace. But at that time, there was recognition of the power and the importance of the office, and there was deference afforded therein. By the time you come to Kennedy, Kennedy then personalizes the office. You know all about his military service. You see this real sense of romanticism towards the office, and part of that was due to technology. He was the first president to really realize the power of the TV media, just as, for better or for worse, we have someone in the office now who has an affinity for small text messages. But they've realized the power of the office, and the office changed as a result.
It's a fascinating point. Some of them began to humanize the office. I think of Lincoln. I mean, in many ways, his humanity, his story was part of his election, I think, right? But not nearly to the extent that it was by the time we get to the 20th century. We begin to know what their wives wear, right? And we begin to know about their marriage and their children and all of who they are. Dr. Briley, did that in any way move us, that 20th century media emergence, that story of the individual, did that move us, in your opinion, toward where we are today, where it's become very personal?
Well, I think clearly in terms of, particularly, one of you mentioned separating reporters from editorials kind of thing. I think clearly, certainly during the FDR, they were, very watchful over him, and to maybe a large degree, maybe a lot had to do with the way that Kennedy played the press, but and also not only looking into a camera, but how he looked on the camera, And so you contrast that, from Eisenhower. Eisenhower hated to do those things. And the press would talk about all these, he would fumble, his sentences, and he'd say, oh, poor old Grandfather Ike, and all that. Now, the reality of it is, they also kind of wrote he was not involved in these things. But I think clearly, Kennedy was probably the last president that we didn't get into a lot of the stuff with his personal life.
They knew about it, they being the press.
Yes.
But didn't go there.
No, exactly.
Yeah, that's kind of over.
Yeah.
There's the shark way back there. We jumped it. And if you want to weigh in on that movement out of a bit of respect for, and respect carries some connotations with it. I don't want to bring with us into discussion. It means like, I respect you. No, I mean like, we can't go there. That's off limits. Any other, we know Kennedy, what moved us in that direction? Dr. Carter, I feel like Bill Clinton's a front and center in this discussion, and you said him quite a bit.
Oh, yes, I would say that he is, but I would go back to Kennedy just for a second to say, you also have to remember that, 3/4 of the country believed in the government as a force for good, and that the government would do the right thing when push came to shove. That dramatically changes with the assassinations, with Vietnam, with Watergate, to by the end of the Clinton era, most people don't trust government at all. And so as you see that slide in the support or belief in the government, you also see a rise in, let's see who these guys really are. Who are their kids? What do their wives do? And surely they're corrupt, so we want to see their tax returns, and we want to see some other things, right? And it became a standard, except for the current administration, to put that information out there. And I think it's helped us understand our politicians a little bit better, but it's also been a very negative thing in the sense that it has allowed politicians to become more celebrity than substantive. So if you look at, for example, the past few administrations, they have hammered hard on, these narratives that really are not sensical or important, but it attracts voters, but it doesn't tell the voters how intelligent they are, how good their judgment is, so on and so forth. So I would point those several things.
That's a fascinating idea, Dr. Glenn. Your background in journalism, I think, follow me here. What we just heard was that the media, which you would think would add depth and context and breadth to the idea of who's running our country, has allowed us to kind of move toward a celebrity culture where a lot of the depth's not there, and if you translate well on TV or on Twitter, you win. Yeah. Do you buy that?
I think there's always been that cult of personality that comes along with the leader of the country. I think you have to look at the Nixon administration as being that term that happens there. You think about many people, many scholars have said that's when America lost its innocence. Vietnam, Watergate, the Friday Night Follies, all the things that happened at that point, to where people were waking up and going, I don't know if these guys have our best interests at heart. And I don't, this guy Nixon, he's telling me one thing, we're finding out other things. And to the point where the Nixon administration even said, once they had lost the mainstream press, right, and in particular, one person in particular, it was okay. But it's just one of those things that I think once people started to stack up the lies and stack things, they started to distrust everything that was coming out of the administration and everything that was happening. And I think it became a big event where now we're starting to look at the politicians more than just being people we want to celebrate, but being people we want to critique and pick apart and look at, okay, you guys do have some ugly things in your closets and things like that. And so I think that's where you really start to see a turning point, and it's echoed in Carter comes in. There's a lot of criticism of Carter and the way he handles particularly Iran and things like that. And then you go to Reagan, and there's criticism of the Iran-Contra affair. And then you go into, I mean, it's like every politician since Watergate has had one of those big, you know, defining kind of scandalous things. Arguably, Obama had probably not, but unless you want to throw in Benghazi, and that's a whole other ball of wax. But ever since then, it's been fair game. And is that the media's fault, or is that the reader's fault? You know, that's arguable.
Or is it a fault of the process?
Yeah.
Because if you look at the election prior to Nixon, the Democrats changed the manner in which they select their candidates. So the parties began to step away from the role of parties as selected entities. The Montgomery-Fraser Commission changed the manner in which the rules of engagement were processed. So then you put forward individuals, and the accent is on the primary, which then politicizes the person. You take away the sorting process that parties provided. No longer do individuals have to learn in the job. They become celebrities, and it's the celebrity aspect that puts you in the greatest probability of getting elected, not your knowledge of the process or your knowledge of policy. No longer are you debating policy at all. The parties lose a basic policy. They become essentially a polarized entity of pro-abortion, anti-abortion, pro-gun, anti-gun. Parties become labels rather than very important roles that they played in the American political process. I would argue process and structure also worked against us.
So platform becomes lost, and it's celebrity of the individual.
I think one thing that occurs to me, sort of if you look at the arc of history with this and some of the examples that my colleagues have mentioned, I think you see a bit of a trend whereby presidents seem to benefit if they get out of the head of a new medium, right, as opposed to sort of reacting to it. We talked earlier about Adams and Jackson with newspapers. There's been a lot of talk about Kennedy, and there's that sort of famous political science story, right, that in the 1960 presidential debate between Kennedy and Nixon, the people who watched on TV all thought Kennedy won, the people who listened on the radio all thought Nixon won. And that had to do with things like physical appearance and demeanor, right? Reportedly Nixon was sick and was sweating and things like that. And Kennedy had some advantages there, connections through his father. They knew how TV worked, and they knew about wearing makeup so that he would look good. And mastering that, getting out in front of it. And then I guess when we talk about sort of new media, and I assume we'll get to some of that later, right? If you consider Twitter, right? Barack Obama had a Twitter account, but used it differently. Right, than our current president does. For better or worse, right? He wasn't arguing about policy and things like that on Twitter. Whether or not you like that, I think you'd be hard-pressed to argue that Trump hasn't benefited from that, from connecting that way with his base, and he sort of was able to get out in front of that. So I think that's kind of an interesting trend. I won't speculate on what the next big media type is. I guess if I could figure that out, I'd be very wealthy. But I don't know what it's going to be, but it'll be interesting to watch if that same sort of pattern continues to hold and gets out in front of that and masters and seems to enjoy an advantage with the electorate.
I want to, we're going to go there. I want to step back to something you said, Dr. Nolan. I want to start with you, and I'm going to take the risk of embarrassing you a little bit. I remember when you applied for the job here, your picture popped up, and it was still in the, courting phase, and someone, I'll never forget it, looked at your picture and went, he looks like a president of something, and you mentioned that image, that celebrity thing that happens. Is this in any way now, when we're in, even acting to discourage some people who might be a great president, from saying, I don't need that. I don't need what it could do to me personally. I don't need what it could do to me as a my family, my livelihood. Have we created a beast that is actually keeping people out of politics? And I'll start with you, Dr. Nolan, and anybody else that wants to jump in on that. Yay or nay, I guess.
I don't know if we've created a beast that's keeping anyone out of the role of public service, but I think we're attracting a different type of individual to the office. In the past, you look for individuals who had training, who had expertise, who had a background, be it a background of service, a background of military service, but someone who knew a little bit about what they were doing. I don't think you would turn any of us over and ask us to run Amazon tomorrow. But we would expect the head of Amazon to know something about being president of the United States. It's counterintuitive. So we've created a structure that attracts celebrity rather than structures that attract expertise. And I think we're suffering from it. There was a celebrity president in Reagan, but Reagan had the experience of serving as governor. He knew what it was like to lead a state. I served on a governor's cabinet. I can attest to the things that come in front of the governor, the decisions they have to make. They are very different decisions than the decisions that a business person would make. So you're bringing people to a position that really have no sense of what's in front of them. And I think we're seeing that today. Someone who expects to have the opportunity to make decisions immediately and for folks to fall in line. But you've got 3 co-equal branches of government, and not everything goes as quickly as you would like.
And that's when you get on Twitter. Anyone else want to jump in on that? Have we created something here that's keeping, like John Adams, would he have ever been elected president today, knowing what we know about him?
I would just add to the president's remarks that the celebrity issue is one part of it, but the anti-intellectualism is another part of it. And that's always been a part of the American political tradition. And so we went from, say, 1960, where you have a man who is promoting the fact that he's a Harvard-educated individual, to now we're talking about the guy who can sound the dumbest on television. And that guy, because it's this false narrative of, well, I can have a drink with him. Well, there's a lot of people I'd like to have a drink with, but I wouldn't put them in charge of a cat house, let alone president of the United States. But there's this false, authentic quality that I think people find with celebrity candidates. So right now, the talk's about the Schultz guy from Starbucks. He doesn't know anything about politics or policy, but he does know about coffee, and I'm sure he can make you a great cup. But that's not going to, necessarily put the country in the best position. Of course, we saw that in a very serious way 2 years ago with the current administration. They didn't care that he knew nothing about the job. They did care about the fact that he sounded like them. And so that's problematic. And it's not just him, but we can see this in every administration going back to Kennedy. This, well, I can't ignore that. So this anti-intellectualism, this, bringing us down to the base level is becoming a serious problem in American politics.
Yeah, this is kind of piggybacking on what Darrell said about the anti-intellectualism and the kind of elite mass difference. I mean, I can go back to some Nixon's earlier better moments. Checkers, to where, in terms of the major media, just like, no, that was horrible. Who are you? But the overwhelming response, in fact, Eisenhower was, in between here. I mean, he was something, more than like, 15,000 to 1 or something, okay? Now, then you fast forward, and I thought about the things, you mean what Andrew said about the Nixon administration, the fact that they had used, after the silent majority speech, okay, and that was early on, okay, when you first, and they jumped over 10 points on that, and the other one with Spiro Agnew, and I'm surprised somebody's not brought it up yet, the effete cores of impudent snobs, of how, that guy, really played into what Darrell was talking about, us against them.
You mentioned the word elitism,
Yes.
as and some would say, is that same or different from the intellectualism? I think that's critical, and that leads us into, as we're kind of the halfway point in our discussion, maybe the part where I'll develop a little bit of an itch, and that's where we start talking about the changes in the media culture, because that's half of our discussion here today. We focused on sort of the evolution of the presidency. We all have to, I think, admit that even the most unbiased among us would say that the press has changed in the way it conducts itself, not just through technology, but in its core mission. So I'll start with our journalism guy here, Dr. Dunn. How have, this idea that the press would be this completely detached, fact-based, just observant, here's what I saw and here's what happened today media, has evolved into what we have now. which all of you know and witness and consume on a daily basis, where opinion mingles with fact and analysis becomes part of the reporting. How has that impacted that interplay with the presidency?
Well, I think you have to go back to the origins of the American press, and it was never what it's always been touted to be, right? This idea that you did buy at one time newspapers that were aligned with you politically, all the way up to the Civil War. When you had abolitionist press, you had pro-slavery press, you had press that represented what you, all the way into the 1960s and the underground press and things like Great Speckled Bird and things like that. Were these tremendous papers that that represented a minority voice, counterculture voice. So we've always had these pockets of press, and I think there's this idea in our heads of this monolithic, very business-like, very scientific-like, objective press, and that has been more or less represented by the AP, right? The Associated Press. Why did the Associated Press do that? And there's some thoughts on that, but part of it is how do you sell, if you've got a news service, right? AP Press, Associated Press, I've got an office, a bureau all around the world. I want to sell you stories from this bureau. How do I sell it to a left-leaning publication and a right-leaning publication? Well, we just report the facts and be as unbiased as we can, and you'll buy it, and you'll buy it, and everybody will buy it, and everybody gets on board. And then suddenly the AP becomes this dominating factor in how we kind of do the press now. And it becomes this, we even still today, I still teach reporting class, and I start with the what we call the Bible for journalists, the AP style book, and it tells you how to cite something, how to say something, how to, what words use, what words not to use, and we start there. And so you see this kind of really a corporation that has had this massive effect on the rest of the business, and we've adopted that. However, people started tiring of that, and they started saying, I don't like what they're saying. I could get into media psychology and hostile media bias and all these things that happen in framing. If we're talking about elitism versus intellectualism, it's oftentimes how people frame the story, right? And so there's all these different things that have made people upset at the press, not to mention the politicians that have also said you should be upset with press, right? And that's not new. That's also been going on forever. And so where we get today is for people, once again, going back to what we used to do, which was subscribe to the press based on our politics, which obviously has some danger to it.
You mean the good old days weren't that good or old? There were no good old days of journalism.
Nostalgia is a heck of a thing, right? The rose-colored glasses are a heck of a thing.
Well, it seems to me, if the train's always been on the track, it seems like it's sped up, though. I mean, would you at least give me that?
I would say the pendulum has swung a little more one way or the other, right? It's a little bit less objective than it used to be, but it's all depending on what you're talking about. As I always tell my students, 2 people died in a fire last night. That's news. Now, who's responsible for that? Who should we point the finger at? Who's to blame? What policies brought us to this? That's all opinion. But 2 people died in a fire last night. That's still news. Josh, if something happens tonight, you have to report on it. It's news.
It is. And
tomorrow we might talk about who, what, when, where, why, and how, and all the details. But tonight we got to report the facts.
You're right. And yet what I've noticed, and I'm not a panelist here, but I've noticed that that now the trigger of you're biased.
Right.
I mean, I've had days where I've gotten 2 emails after the 6 o'clock news that blasted me for being left and one blasted me for being right. And I look back and we talked about the Irwin Apple Festival, so it's like...
You did what you're supposed to do. You did your job perfectly. If you make everybody happy, you've done something wrong. If you make one side happy, you've done something wrong. If you make everybody mad, you did the best job you did.
A third of the room hates me, a third loves me, and a third has no clue who I am. So just that third I'm worried about. How about you, Dr. Glennon? Are we, and maybe that's where we need to take this discussion next. Is there a line, though, that we've crossed, in your opinion, where now we have a media that maybe is so pocketed, to borrow the term, that no one really knows where to turn, and maybe there's mass mistrust for the mass media?
Well, I guess to take the cop-out answer, I guess it's maybe. But because I think that depends on what you actually want from the media, right? You mentioned this idea of bias, and I think it's important that we always remember when we talk about media bias, right? It's not a fact, right? It's not anything you can prove. It's a perception, and you can accuse someone of bias, but I don't know that you can actually prove it to be true, except in the cases where the person you're accusing just admits it, right? If they're upfront about something or a viewpoint. Sometimes political scientists will use this term that we call narrowcasting, right? Which is just created to be the opposite of broadcasting, right? But the idea is that you're aiming your message at a specific audience that has a specific known point of view from the beginning. And I think the prevalence, or at least the success of that, has grown substantially over the last 30 or 40 years. I don't know, I think a good example might be if you consider Rush Limbaugh, right? And he said, I'm going to have this radio show for conservatives. And he had a hard time pitching it, right? No one's going to listen to that. Well, I don't know, $80 cajillion later, he was right? I mean, he was right about, you don't have to agree with anything else he ever said. He was right about that, right? There was an audience there, and they wanted to listen to him. And then you have just seen subsequent follow-ups with that, and that expands from radio into websites, right, that sort of aggregate content, things like Drudge or HuffPost, right, that clearly are aimed at one viewpoint. But your question, I guess I went on too far of a tangent, was have we crossed the line? And I guess that just depends on what you want. If you're comfortable with having your beliefs told back to you, then I suppose no, right? And it's fighting human nature to not like that, right? It's good, it's fun to turn on the television or click on a link or turn on the radio and hear someone say to you, everything you think is true, right? Wonderful, what a great day, right? So you're fighting human nature to not get sort of sucked up in that. How bad that is? I don't know, it's probably not ideal, but I'm not sure of a definitive answer, or if it could go back. I'm not sure how that would look.
Dr. Nolan, there was a time when Americans would turn on the evening news and watch Walter Cronkite, and if he said it, they believed it. At least that's the narrative. I'm not so sure that's always the truth, but every American felt that way. But I'm curious, and we'll come back through the panel on this one. Have we reached a point where that is no longer the case, that the national press is no longer considered to be an authoritative source that is beyond reproach?
I don't know if we've reached that point. I may take this in a little bit different direction. I think we've reached a point where we as a nation are lazy. We're not willing to read. We're not willing to investigate. We're not willing to do our homework. We want something immediately. We want it in an email. And we take that to be a fact. Look what happens to newsrooms, the number of reporters that work for JHL now compared to 20 years ago, or who work for any major press compared to 20 years ago. I still read the New York Times. I like to hold it. Sunday New York Times is a wonderful gift. How many people take the time to read a paper and then read a different perspective and then form an opinion? So I think we get what we deserve. The press no longer, and not being critical, but there's not detailed or researched or nuanced stories. You follow a horse race. There's a tweet. Oh, what did he say? What's the response to the tweet? What's the response to that tweet? We don't talk about policy or substance in elections. It's who's ahead. This horse is in the lead. They're up by 2 lengths. Oh, here comes this one on fast. We follow the horse race. We don't ever ask, why are we running the race? And at some point, we've got to return back to a focus on substance and policy, because until we as Americans start to read rather than just look at tweets, you all are just going to give us what we want, because that's what advertisers pay you to do.
That means the press is lazy.
I would say yes.
Sense,
it's a lot easier to follow the horse race or to talk about someone's tweet than it is to actually do some homework. I'm not being critical of you, but I look at the downside of newspapers. Look at how there's no substance to news. Pick a newspaper right now. Go to the Johnson City Press. I bet if I were to look at my phone, we're going to have a shoplifting, someone overdosed, We've got a domestic violence piece. There'll be a feel-good piece on somebody's dog, and then there'll be something about sports. That's the front page of the Johnson City Press's website every day of the week. That's not news. That's selling stuff for clicks for advertisers.
And your argument that it's because in-depth reporting doesn't get the clicks sometimes because the consumers are lazy as well.
Hence, we have politicians who follow suit.
You know, we've had issues that have had the potential to destroy a presidency that were, like I think of back in the 90s, the banking and the financial scandals, and it was just so complex, housing and loan, and it didn't translate well on television. But a blue dress, that translated well on television, right? And so the presidency has had to deal with the ramifications. Do any of you have any other ideas or thoughts to chime in on that?
Well, this is kind of with the composition of the press, and it goes back more historically, and I guess I was kind of brain dead initially. I think back to what Tocqueville said in the 1830s, when he in one of, this is in his, in his first 10 books, where he describes journalism in America. Okay, and he compares France in terms of the topics, which goes to Dr. Nolan's point about in France there's these strong opinions and these serious discussions, but in America there's not. And of course now then he describes the journalists coming from a very lowly lot, and they're essentially seeking headlines. And then he says, well, but he draws a lot of this because it's private, and it's for advertisers, and it's for selling. And so that's what he draws a good bit of that to. And I think it's,
very closely.
I just checked, it wasn't a dog, it was an alligator.
Oh, okay.
If you go to JC Press, there's an alligator.
ate the dog.
Great.
It's Wednesday, so it must be a gator, right?
So I don't want to get too like we're beating up on the press too much. So let's keep in mind we still do some really great in-depth pieces. Do you read them? Right? And that's what. So I go back to to talk about some difficulties. So the crash of 2008, right? Really difficult. You've got the housing market, you've got subprime loans, you've got all this stuff that's interwoven. I read some really great in-depth pieces. I go to my friends who I consider to be intellectuals. I don't know, maybe elitist if we're going to term it that way. I have some intellectual friends. I said, did you read this piece? Nope. What are your thoughts on it? It is what it is. I didn't lose any money, so I think there's some great stuff out there. Is it everywhere? No. But if you don't subscribe to your papers and you don't pay your people, and we start losing reporters, I don't know how in the hell anybody is going to be able to do all the news in one day for one person, right? So it's tough. It's a resources game, and there's not enough resources to go around. You don't have somebody to go out there and do that story. I mean, just sending someone to D.C. to cover something. I worked in the Tallahassee paper. I worked in Lakeland, Florida, Central Florida. When am I going to go to D.C. to do that story? Who's going to send me there? Who's going to pay that bill? So we got to rely on our people in D.C. to do that story. And sometimes they do good stuff, and then something else comes up and they do something else. It's a matter of resources. There's only so many warm bodies that can cover these stories. Would we love to have more copy and more time? Absolutely. Somebody's got to pay for that, right? And so it's a much more complex problem, I think, than what we typically kind of shortcut to, right?
And it affects the context of our discussion, which is the relationship between the press and the presidency, because sometimes it's not just an easy click story that needs to be talked about and the top story on the evening news. But I want to talk to you all about something else, and that is something that I think seems to me to be fairly new, and that is that we have a president who is directly, not indirectly, directly questioning the trustworthiness of the press that's covering him on a daily basis, almost on a daily basis. To the extent even this past week, the president by name questioned the integrity of a Fox News reporter and another Fox News colleague that launches back out after him and accuses the president